Thank you very much again for the opportunity to be here. Anyone seeing the screen, if I can just move this down slightly, they should be able to, if you need any of my details in terms of my email address or my website, it should all be here. So please, feel free to get in contact whenever you want, and we can talk more about my research and future directions. Again, I think the introduction by everyone involved, Andrea, Edna, Sylvia, and Decano Juan Pablo was fantastic. Honestly, I was an economist up until about 5 years ago. And then for various reasons, I'm just gonna make this small. For various reasons, I got, fall involved and interested in economic history. Um, I'll be honest, when I started, it was pretty negative. In fact, there was plenty of articles coming out about the decline of economic history, the regression, the smaller amount of departments specializing in economic history or having things like an economic history master's. So being here today to see a new economic history master's in a country as important as Colombia at a university as so wrapped in history as Externado, who've produced some of the most famous economists in the history of Colombia, it's just fantastic. So yeah, honestly, a real honor to be here. I will start by saying, a big question. Why and how do you study forced labor from a historical perspective? I think it's a bit tricky in some respects because if I was sat here today presenting about trade, presenting about unions or something that very much still exists and is still a topic, I think it would be a much more, easy sell. We do live in a world, thankfully, where forced labor to some extent is a lot less than it was in the past. However, I think it's very underappreciated that as I have this quote here by Athemoglu, Walitsky, and also the historian Finlay, for most of human history, the majority of labor transactions have been coercive. There has been this threat of force present. Kind of a famous joke is who built the pyramids? It wasn't the Egyptians, really, it was the slaves working for the Egyptians, the enslaved population. So I think one reason to study forced labor and why it's such an important topic is we just sometimes forget just how common it was up until very recently. I actually have this little reference to an article here which shows that unfortunately it is still a problem in many countries around the world today. I picked this particular article because Angola is a country I focus on a lot, but as this article shows, unfortunately, workers in that country are still subject to quite extreme levels of a coercion in certain circumstances today. Um, and this is really actually why I focused on Portuguese colonial Africa. I would argue it was the last place where widespread use of forced labor was sanctioned by the state, okay? Where an institutional norm had been created that allowed forced labor to exist right up until quite well into the second half of the 20th century. Really one could argue there was still elements of forced labor at play right up until 1975 when the Portuguese eventually left. At the same time, a lot of my research focuses on mines. I find mines fascinating. I haven't been there yet, but one day, if you want to go, anyone here, I would very much like to go to the emerald mines of Boyaca. Obviously not too far from where you guys are sitting now. I find mines fascinating for various reasons, but from an economic history perspective, the great thing about mining companies is they tend to keep very, very good data about what they're doing. This means that particularly when they don't think what they're doing is a bad thing with relation to forced labor, you can get some of the richest data available, particularly for Africa, on what was basically a highly, highly coercive institutional environment. And that's a good and a bad thing, but if you want to do economic history, you do need good, strong data. And mining is a particularly good industry to focus on. Finally, my research kind of agenda has always looked at a comparative aspect of African colonies. The fascinating thing, this is a great quote by Sami Armin, a very famous historian, who, kind of makes the point that the colonization of Africa actually created more diversity between the countries. Okay, and this is really what I think I see in my research, and I think you'll see if you read my research and my papers, is that the institutional environments that existed between countries that bordered each other, for example, Angola and the Congo, Zambia and Mozambique, were wildly different over the 20th century. And this is really useful from an economic or an economic historian's perspective because it allows these very long-term comparisons and really interesting insights to be kind of drawn on how institutional environments and institutional differences can cause these long-term, differences in what we see and how society functions. So that's kind of my pitch on why I think studying forced labor is important. And I think in general, studying anything from a historical perspective has a lot of use in the modern world. Now I'm going to do what's increasingly common. Oh, I'm going to try and move my slide. There we go. Increasingly common, I notice, amongst both economists and economic historians, which is I'm going to give you my, results up front, and then I'm going to go through the presentation and basically say the same thing again. First, though, I was a bit nervous, let's say, or a bit apprehensive about doing a masterclass because, if anything, I think after doing a PhD and after getting these publications, if anything, I feel less like a master of economic history than I did, 5 years ago. However, I think the reason maybe why it could be useful for me to present to you guys today in this masterclass is that I think my PhD and the papers that have come out of it really show why doing economic history can be so exciting. For me, and one of the major reasons why I just didn't follow a pure econ PhD route was, to me on day one, you basically have to say, I'm a microeconomist or I'm a macroeconomist. Okay. That's something that never really appealed to me too much. I've always been very interested in but the micro fundamentals of economics as well as the wider macroeconomic implications of the major topics we study. At the same time, I think with economic history and particularly I don't know, I feel in my PhD, it's been a really good opportunity to do lots of really different things. And in the first paper, I really, it's a very theoretical paper, as you'll see in a second. It's highly theoretical. Not much data really is involved. It really revolves around a model and helping using a model to explain a historical process. Then my second paper, highly narrative. So what I mean by that, it's, lots of data and a lot of data collection was involved and really getting this very interesting time series graphs that go over a long period of time to make these inter-imperial comparisons between the empires. It wasn't a particularly difficult methodology, but what it really involved with was just tons of narrative data. So, again, already very different. Then the third paper I'll be discussing very briefly today, was very technical. Again, drew on a lot of data, but it was actually much more the very technical methodology of growth accounting. That was very complicated at times, but to kind of get these insights. So something I really like about, studying economic history is you can mix these different things, which I think you can do a lot more than, again, maybe if you focused on a more pure economics topic. Okay, so again, my findings, forced labor is harmful. So yeah, if anyone falls off their chair in shock at that, I'd be very surprised. I think though what, my PhD and my research really brings out is that obviously forced labor is bad for people. That's not that surprising, but actually its effects run far deeper. This is due to these, three particular points, which is forced labor is so dangerous because it's self-reinforcing by nature. Okay. As I'll show in a second, the issue with forced labor is that it tends to crowd out free markets. It creates this doom loop, as I like to call it, this vicious cycle of additional necessary coercion to get more or less the same level of output, whether that be at the firm level or the economic level. So that's one reason. The second is it harms not only workers directly employed in forced labor, but also those within countries, those within the wider labor market, both within and beyond a country's borders. I'm going to talk more about that when I discuss paper two. And maybe the most counterfactual finding, counterintuitive finding of my research is that actually forced labor is not just bad for the worker. what I showed in his third paper, which is under review still, so don't want to push it too hard, is that actually while short term it does have a short term benefit for owners of capital for management, okay, but it has this very negative long term impact on productivity, okay, so it discourages capital investment and other productivity enhancing investments, which means in the long term, even the firms that use forced labor are worse off. Okay, so they're my headline findings. I'm just going to discuss them in a bit more detail. First, though, I do need to give a bit of context. I have presented before, and people have come up to me afterwards and been like, I didn't even know the Portuguese had an African empire. I thought it was just Brazil. But no, that's not really the case. As I always like to say, the Portuguese really, as this graph on the left shows, the Portuguese very much were the first to arrive and kind of the last to leave. They were there for, getting on for, well, probably over 500 years. Okay, so, one reason to study the Portuguese Empire was just the sheer length of its empire. At the same time, it's highly understudied. I'm already self-referencing myself, not a good thing to do. But basically, I did a very, very extensive literature review in one of my papers, and of the huge amount of research that's kind of taken place on Africa in the last 2 decades in particular, only one of the papers had focused on the Portuguese Empire. Compared to the British, the French, the Belgian empires, it is highly understudied, which, as I'm going to kind of show today, is quite a shame because relative to the other empires, it was the one that was, the biggest anomaly by far. It increasingly so as time went on, it diverged from what was going on in the rest of colonial Africa, which is useful for actually studying institutions, but you know, it's a shame because it's not studied enough. In particular, I'll be focusing on diamond mining, and particular one diamond mine in particular, which is Diamang. It was one of the largest diamond mines of the 20th century, employing tens of thousands of workers across many, many decades. And I think as this photo on the right kind of shows, often under highly coercive and extractive practices. Okay. So again, paper one, which was a much more theoretical paper, titled Explaining the Transition from Forced to Free Labor in Colonial Angolan's Diamond Mines. There has been a resurgence in interest in monopsony power as opposed to monopoly power. And we've seen this across many different fields within economics and economic history. So I very much was also kind of interested in studying a very large monopsony operator in a very coercive institutional environment. What I show, very quickly, I know we don't have too much time, is that basically the more employees, okay, a firm has, we can see that by this vertical, so our horizontal purple line here. Okay, the more employees it employs, the greater the incentive it is to have a coercive labor supply. Okay. And again, you really see this occurring in Portuguese Africa during the 20th century. As I kind of say here, and I think it is, you have to see forced labor both in the past and today as an infection. The longer it's allowed to spread, the harder it is to stop. Portuguese Africa, due to allowing forced labor to, you know, be as widespread and to continue as long as possible, to continue for so long, made firms in the Portuguese Empire far less inclined to to stop using forced labor. Okay. This created, what we might call a path dependent, not maybe I wouldn't want to say persistent, but a very path dependent environment that made it far harder for firms and the colony itself to kind of move away from forced labor, even as international pressure grew. Okay. This wasn't just at the firm I studied. While I studied this firm in particular, as I mentioned, due to the very good data that existed due to its mining operations, this was widespread across the Angolan and Mozambican economies, in the sugar plantations, in the cotton plantations, even in the railway systems. Forced labor was utilized in all elements of the economy. Okay, so it really did spread and became increasing, because of the way it spread so much, was increasingly hard to stop. again, I'm going to kind of use the word path dependent, is basically what we see is relative to the other imperial empires that existed. As time went on, things were actually getting worse in Angola. Okay. And I don't talk about Mozambique here, but that's the case. The amount of forced labor being used at individual firms and across the wider economy was increasing and increasing. This really starts to make it diverge from what you see in the rest of Africa. Okay, during this period, in like let's say the 1950s in Africa, you started seeing in British colonies the franchise being given to African citizens, some African citizens. Okay, you start to see the election of African people into political power. What do we see in Angola is, it's getting worse and worse. Um, how is this reflected and it's getting worse? This kind of constant hunger for more workers because of the inherent inefficiency of forced labor meant, first of all, you started to see after World War II an increase in the amount of women and children being used within firms, often for forced labor as well. And at the same time, you just see this huge exodus. Okay. I think slightly unfairly, the Belgian Congo is tend to be viewed as the ultimate worst colonial power, colonial experience. The interesting thing I find from my research is in this period, particularly as time goes on, you start to see, particularly in regions near the border just go back because I think it's important, with the Belgian Congo, you see actually an exodus of Angolans into the Belgian Congo. So as bad as it was in the Belgian Congo, you still see people from Portuguese Angola moving there. Okay, just quick word. Then I just finish off with this paper. One thing again, I'm obviously this is a masterclass on economic history, so I'm trying to plug economic history as much as possible. But a really nice thing about economic history is unlike some elements of economics, it doesn't pretend that politics and economics are completely interlinked. Okay, it doesn't take the positive view that it's a political neutral subject. The great thing about studying these cases, and particularly in Africa, is you just see that it was actually politics or political forces, not economic, that eventually dismantled this highly coercive situation. It wasn't economic forces that really caused the monopoly or monopsony power to suddenly change. It was actually the African population in different forms. For example, the unexpected independence of the Congo, combined with Kwame Nkrumah's petition to the ILO to basically pressure the Portuguese colonial administration to basically reduce the amount of force to stop using forced labor. And maybe most importantly of all was, Angolans and Mozambicans in this Portuguese empire rising up and trying to, gain independence because of the treatment by the Portuguese colonial authorities. Okay. So that's, very interesting end to this was actually it was a political forces that really pushed this. So after studying this, my first paper, after studying kind of Angola in isolation, I felt it was very necessary to really see just how bad things were. As I just mentioned, one way that was reflected was the huge exodus of people moving from Angola and Mozambique to other areas of Africa. But to do this, I think in a bit more, as I kind of said earlier, in a narrative way over a long period of time, I wanted to see, okay, just how much living standards varied depending if you're in Portuguese Angola or Portuguese Mozambique relative to other colonies during this period. Um, so again, a great thing about economic history that you might not get in other social sciences is you have to spend a lot of time in archives. And don't get me wrong, this can be hard. A lot of archives do not have very good air conditioning, and sometimes the bureaucracy can be very tricky as well, but it can be a lot of fun. And here, just not all the countries, but over the last few years, a lot of the countries I've been in to do this archival research, it's been a fantastic experience. I couldn't recommend more, like doing something similar to this. Yeah, life-changing. Um, So basically, even though the Portuguese had been there for 500 years, no one had ever done a quantitative assessment of actually living standards of these empires. So that's exactly what I did, and I guess is maybe the main finding of my recent research has been just how low living standards were. I don't really have time to go into exactly what a welfare ratio is, but basically what it's saying that in Portuguese Africa, particularly in Angola, for a long period of time, workers were not even hitting what we would call a subsistence level of income. Okay, the ratios, the living standards were really low, even lower than you would expect. And comparing even to other colonial empires, not really places you would assume to be great for worker welfare, worker living standards. What do we see? Is in these Portuguese colonies, things were bad from a comparative perspective. Okay, so that's a big finding. Possibly even more interesting was when we do eventually see the end of forced labor, or at least widespread forced labor, what do we see very quickly? Up kind of 1960 really is when you start to see a reduction in this. The government, basically, the colonial government starts to repeal forced labor is almost overnight. In a period of a few years, you see living standards increase by what we would kind of expect to see happen over many decades. Okay, so really living standards take off, the second forced labor is reduced or is stopped in the Portuguese colonial empire. Oh. I think even more interesting to me though was this other finding, which was that free workers were, forced labor didn't just hurt those who were forced into the various mines, the various sugar plantations that existed during this period. What I also show in this paper is that forced labor also had a really big impact on those who are technically free, okay, working in Portuguese Africa. Okay. And I think you have to be careful when you say volunteer labor in a colonial context. But there was a volunteer in most firms that existed, or most companies that existed, they usually had some forced labor and some free labor. What did we see is that the free labor actually really didn't get paid much more than a contracted labor. They maybe had slightly better conditions or a little bit more control over day-to-day work, but in general, their wages were really low because of the fear of being pushed into a forced labor force. So what I call this really is kind of this institution acts like an anti-union. Okay, it really, like, workers in a colonial context possibly didn't have that much bargaining power, but when there's a forced labor segment of a workforce that you could potentially end up in, you don't really have much bargaining power. So I kind of call this almost an anti-union effect. Importantly, as I kind of said, this wasn't just within the Portuguese Empire. In fact, the real impact of this maybe was its impact on the rest of colonial Africa or the rest of Africa during this period. What do we see? We see this today. There's huge amounts of migration, internal migration in Africa, but in the past, this was also huge as well. Is that what Portuguese African institutions did is, well, they didn't operate in isolation because labor markets never do. Your wage is determined by wages paid in not just your own country, but in other countries as well. I think we can all appreciate that. But what you see in this period is Mozambique and Angola, because forced labor was so common, it pushed cheap Portuguese African labor into the other colonies. Okay. During this period, the mines of South Africa were incredibly hungry for labor. I show this in the paper. What you see is that basically because labor was particularly coming from Mozambique and they were willing to work for such low wages, it has a huge deflationary effect on wages across South Africa, Rhodesia during this period as well. And these are huge numbers of workers. We're talking hundreds of thousands of workers who all were probably affected by what was going on within the Portuguese Empire during this period. We're moving very fast now. This is still a working paper, so please don't take everything as definitely the case. But I'm quite certain that what we see as well is that if you treat workers as cheap, you get cheap workers. Diamang, like many colonial African firms, and I would argue firms today, created basically what I would call is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, and it's, given the colonial context, racism was abundant, but basically these firms believed that workers were inherently inefficient due to various factors. Therefore, they should only employ many at an artificially a low wage. Okay, use forced labor because they're so inefficient. They should be forced into labor at a very low wage because the wages are so low. There's no real incentive to invest or modernize, and productivity flatlines. Okay, it's a pretty big theory, but looking at this firm, particularly the diamond firms during this period, I show that really during a period of extreme forced labor, so pre-1960, Angola and Mozambique, this firm, and these are still like this is just a very quick measure of basically output, mining output. It's still used today in most, again, if you probably go up to the emerald mines of Boyaca, you'll probably find firms using the exact same measures of output. What you see is that pre-1960, they could only increase output by employing more labor, usually through forced or coercive methods. Okay. However, almost immediately, really immediately, after the end of forced labor, when this firm suddenly realized it couldn't just maintain kind of this flat labor supply anymore, that if it wanted more labor, it was going to have to pay more, suddenly, right away, the incentive to invest and modernize just basically takes off right away. In the post 1960 period, actually, the firm didn't really increase its labor force. But what did you see? Is this massive takeoff in these key production indicators and gravel treated as well as the overburden removed. Okay, here on this graph on the right hand side, I really show that the wages increase and a bit later you see this massive increase in productivity. Okay, that just had basically been flatlining before. Now, I don't want to talk about exactly, I don't want to go to given a time, I don't want to go into exactly why that happened. It is kind of a capital story and a labor productivity story. But to me, it's fascinating that so quickly after a change in an institution from basically extractive to, I don't want to say inclusive, but more inclusive, you see this movement away from just no productivity to huge productivity increases. Um, yeah, so sorry, I just need to move this. So kind of coming to the end really of the presentation here. Um, this is why I titled my PhD in this presentation, The Economics of Forced Labor. We do live in a world where forced labor is much less obvious, but I think it's still important to remember just how disastrous forced labor is. Um, I just wanted to quickly show my growth accounting results, just to show the kind of more technical aspect of this research. This firm, and I didn't really mention it earlier, but I did a comparative study between different firms operating in different colonial empires. Before 1960, the firm could like all output increases really came through labor. Post 1960, it was completely different. So you can see how quickly things change. Unfortunately, as this case shows, it was a highly path dependent situation. This Angola was the country in Africa that had the most enslaved people taken to the New World. Slavery was endemic under the Portuguese. After slavery came forced labor, and today, as I think my article at the beginning of this presentation shows, unfortunately, labor protection and rights are still very weak there. However, I think it's still really important to study because we need to understand better that forced labor really distorts the organization of society. Okay. I think because of these three guys here, recent winners of the Nobel Prize, they have brought out a bit more just how underappreciated factor forced labor is and why nations fail. But it's something that I think as a profession we do need to study more to really get to the bottom of why forced labor can really just be so disastrous for society. Now, I wanted to put this in because, as I said, maybe to some people at the beginning of the presentation, I was recently in my favorite country in the world, which is Colombia. Um, I believe James Robinson does teach in Bogota, I think in Los Andes University. And I think he does start with a kind of controversial statement, which he likes, which is Colombia is just America, but things went wrong. I think he does that for controversy. And I think maybe given what's been going on in the USA recently, he might have to rephrase that. But I was there recently, and some of the things I like most about Colombia, the chiva buses or these beautiful fields that are just so green. I guess maybe given my last few years basically of studying coercive labor markets under a colonial context, I did definitely look at them in a very different way. That's not in Colombia. Like every time I go to Brussels or Lisbon or London now, you really do realize how much those cities were influenced by colonization. But I guess in the case of Colombia, I'm interested to see, is it a case that extractive labor markets are still highly shaping what we see in Colombia? I guess most people will know, maybe people from outside Colombia wouldn't notice, but on the right, we have a coffee plantation here. Beautiful, as nice, honestly, one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in rural Antioquia. But the capital investment over 250 years was basically one pipe. It's not exactly at the forefront of technological enterprise. So I do kind of think, okay, how much of what we see in Colombia is a result of its history of coercive labor conditions that still permeate to some extent within the country today? I believe I'm getting very close to my time limit. I might have even gone over it. I just wanted to also, if given this is meant to be a masterclass, I did want to kind of say it's such an exciting time to do this kind of work. In the past, to do this kind of cross-comparative imperial research where you're comparing different countries that speak different languages was just very hard. You'd need a team of 3 or 4 people who could, who could speak the different languages. You'd need the research assistants. Even since I started doing this 4 years ago, particularly in the last 2 years with the rise of ChatGPT in particular, the ability to, you know, do this kind of cross-comparative work is just the cost of doing it has just fallen so dramatically. I sometimes wish I started my PhD a few years later, after AI had become what it is, and I could have maybe done it in half the time and just spent 2 years on holiday in Colombia. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that. But yeah, so I really do stress if you already speak Spanish and good English, and you have the technology, the ability to work in these different cultural contexts is just, really fascinating. So I really, really do stress to kind of, if you are kind of interested in doing economic history, try take an international comparative approach. My next point is applied economic history. Um, this is new and I think still controversial. There's a lot of economic historians who shy away from getting involved in policy debates for good reason, I would say. But, mainly, I would say if you could thank anyone in particular, Thomas Piketty, his research on long-term historical inequality and how it led into maybe policy proposals, I think has inspired a lot of people, economists and economic historians, to take a long-term approach to solving some of the most pressing challenges we face today, whether it be inequality, low levels of development, the environment. Um, yeah, and I think from that, my own, research has been very much we need to talk about reparations, okay? Because when I study Portuguese Angola and Portuguese Mozambique, I don't ask, after doing it for so long, I don't ask the question, why are these countries so poor? Which has been a very big question over the last 20 years. Honestly, when you study just how coercive and how extractive these institutional environments were, the question should be, why are they even poor? How have they managed to even get to the levels they are at, given their recent and long-term economic history? And I think a great thing economic historians can do is bring, a holistic view of taking a really long period approach and combining it with lots of data. The first question on anyone's lips when you talk about reparations, and I don't think it even really matters if they tend to take a positive or a negative view, is how can you possibly put a value on reparations? Turns out it's actually quite easy. you just basically need good data. The Portuguese Empire collect really good data on what they were doing. So here's just a quick a quick overview of some work I'm doing with my co-authors, Peter Gibbon and Sam Jones. We can quite easily put a dollar value on how much was extracted from these colonial populations by just paying very, very low wages and very taxing the population as well at a very high rate. So yeah, again, I think another reason why economic history is so exciting to be studied, is so exciting to study at the moment, is policymakers want to hear a lot more of what we want to say compared to even 5 years ago. Um, Great. So thank you very much for the time. I meant to say this at the beginning. If you can visit Mozambique, I think particularly from a Latin perspective, it will blow your mind. It's so like Latin America, but also so like not Latin America. It's so Africa as well. So if you can, I would really highly recommend getting to Maputo and Mozambique sometime in the future. And in general, Africa, fantastic place to travel. Again, I have this QR. If you follow the dinosaur, you should be able to access my website. And if you want to contact me about anything, I'd be more than happy to respond. But yeah, thank you very much for your time. I'm very excited to hear what discussion we kind of go into now. Click this.
Gracias, profesor Leo, por su entusiasmo y su claridad en la exposición. Creo que combina muy bien esos mundos entre la economía y la historia que nos ayudan a no olvidarnos de la teoría, pero también entender sus límites en sus contextos y poder comprender que, pues desde el surgimiento de lo que llamamos capitalismo, este sistema se ha consolidado como una forma muy singular de organizar la actividad económica, pues es capaz de articular territorios, recursos, sistemas laborales y mercados como en diferentes etapas que terminan traslapados a una escala global y
Ujú,
que nos acostumbramos a llamar capitalismo, pero pues si vamos a la teoría económica, cuando uno dice dónde está el mercado de tierra, dónde está el mercado de trabajo y dónde está el mercado de capital, pues es muy difícil de explicar porque no van en los mismos procesos, con las mismas características, en las mismas llaves o combinaciones,
ujú,
pero funcionan y funciona teniendo unos ganadores claros para un lado y unos perdedores para el otro que realmente pues muchas veces terminan invisibilizados y que no logramos explicar y que pues es todo un reto incluso ético y moral tratar de recuperar, ¿no? Y en ese sentido pues nuestros colegas de las ciencias sociales cuando nos preguntan a los historiadores económicos o a los economistas que qué es el mercado laboral, pues es mucho más difícil explicarlo como cualquier otro mercado. Entonces, muy, muy amable por la presentación que hoy nos muestra porque hace un muy buen ejercicio de lo micro a lo macro. Entonces, permite con información nueva y muy de largo plazo, que también es un ejercicio de archivo muy valioso darnos luces de cómo se podrían hacer este tipo de ejercicios. Así que mil gracias. Me gustaría intentar abrir la posibilidad en nuestra audiencia, si alguien quisiera hacer una pregunta, un comentario, una sugerencia, como bien decía el profesor Leonard, muy, muy bienvenido. No sé si alguien quisiera abrir su micrófono y interactuar con nosotros. No, nadie. Bueno, mientras se
Ah,
animan,
bueno,
entonces, no,
fácil para mí. Uf. Mucho más
no, mientras se
fácil.
animan, me gustaría entonces intentar preguntarte cuáles fueron como los grandes retos en términos metodológicos de poder hacer estas comparaciones que bien explicabas. No son tan sencillos cuando uno habla, a pesar de que está hablando de la misma región de países que pueden tener diferentes estructuras culturales, religiosas, incluso de idiomas y que pues finalmente pueden pues poner canchas muy diferentes en términos del juego y de la articulación y tratar luego de hacer esas generalizaciones. Y si ves la posibilidad de hacer algo parecido en el desarrollo de los capitalismos latinoamericanos, porque algunas de las dificultades que tenemos en América Latina cuando hacemos historia económica es que nos quedamos muy en lo local y las comparaciones de región nos cuestan mucho y pues coincide nuestra historia económica de que fueron dos imperios diferentes los que nos colonizaron y en ese sentido a veces una es la historia de Brasil y otra es la historia de la América española. Entonces, ¿ves alguna posibilidad metodológica de que podamos seguir construyendo a este lado del Atlántico este tipo de ejercicios?
Pues muchas gracias por la pregunta, Edna. Creo que necesito responder en inglés, perdón, porque es mi cabeza con dos cosas al mismo tiempo es muy difícil. De hecho, my initial doctorado title was Companies and Labor in 20th Century Latin America and Africa. Initially, it was meant to be a comparative study of both continents. After a year, I realized that was a little bit too optimistic. Like, as much as I wanted to go to Colombia and Brazil and also South Africa, you can only spend so much time on a plane before you go a little bit crazy. But it's something I really want to look at in the future. I think the history of capitalism, because of various reasons, is really being studied at the moment. And I think the cases of Latin America and Africa are raising a lot of questions to how we've kind of viewed capitalism and the history of capitalism in the past. I think Sven Beckert's work has really opened a lot of doors and I think a really big research area. And broadly, I think if I could summarize, I think would be there's been a movement away from looking at why did Europe and really Northwest Europe. Why did Northwest Europe take off? What was so remarkable about Northwest Europe that led to it being the first place to have modern economic growth? There's a reason for that, but I think there's now more interested in what was going on in the rest of the world. What was the relationship between what was happening in England and the Netherlands and France and what it was doing in the rest of the world that allowed capitalism to take off in the way it did. So maybe less of kind of this, I would say this as an Irish person, but this like English superiority or English speciality in something, but more about, okay, what was taken and extracted from the rest of the world that allowed some areas of the world to just become 100 times richer in, 2020 US dollars than some countries in the world that are unfortunately haven't. And I think it's a really important. And I think even the question of the developing world is one that we need to kind of analyze because Mozambique isn't developing, relatively speaking. The gap between Mozambique and its former colonial power, Portugal, in absolute terms, has only ever been getting bigger, really, since the end of colonization. So I think there is a big question over why some places haven't managed to take off at all, and some places are just getting richer. I would add to that, when I was in Colombia recently, I was amazed at how quickly things seem to be getting better there. Again, very Medellin focused. I can't say I saw too much of Bogota, but I'm amazed compared to when I was there 6 years ago. It's definitely a country that's having an economic I don't know if revolution's too strong a word, but it's moving to me at least, things are moving very fast there. Sorry. That was a long answer to a short question.
No, no,
Sorry.
no, no, no te preocupes. A propósito, como esta es una masterclass que invita a nuestra audiencia a hacer trabajos en historia económica, ¿qué
Mhm.
temas y de qué manera podrían hacerse tesis en historia económica desde Colombia en estos contextos? O sea, ¿cómo te lo imaginas?
Good question. Let me think. So I think I already said
Te lo pregunto
cross.
porque, te lo pregunto porque el año pasado hicimos nuestro Congreso Nacional de Historia Económica en Medellín, estuvimos en la Universidad de AFIT. Y uno de los grandes temas que yo noté muy ausente es que tuvo poco convocatoria la historia económica laboral. En el país casi no la estamos trabajando y la necesitamos resucitar. Entonces, por eso me gustaría aprovechar tu experiencia, pero sobre todo tu entusiasmo en invitar a desarrollar tesis en esta línea.
Wow, that's really interesting because in African, like recently, the ILO sponsored a big book on the history of labor in Africa, and I think labor economic history is just taking off in Africa. So it's curious that that's not the case in AFIT, which is a great, AFIT's a very interesting place, lovely campus.
Bienvenido, es
Amazing.
una gran área de trabajo, te necesitamos.
Um, no, one thing I personally, I don't think I'm really answering your question very well, but something I feel that needs to happen more is Colombian people studying what's happening in Mozambique or Mozambicans studying what's happening in Colombia. A lot of economic history is written by people from Northern Europe and who, like the history of Ghana by someone from England, the history of the Ivory Coast from someone from France. This is something I would personally like to see. I don't know if we will see. I would like to see more Brazilians talking about Ethiopia. I would like to see more Ghanaians talking about Paraguay because I think still it's very easy to fall into the kind of classic dichotomy of like what people from Western Europe or America think about what's happening in certain countries. So to me, a bigger kind of maybe meta answer to your question of what people should be focusing on is focus on stuff like why is an Irish guy focusing on the Portuguese Empire? I don't have a good question to that answer. Sorry, answer to that question, but it gives you different insights. So to me, that would be something.